Hi there, everybody. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Ghost Lady of Pennsylvania, Patty Wilson. Hi,
Hi,
Patty.
Stu. How are you doing tonight?
Fair to Midland.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. So I had a request from one of our listeners. He's an avid listener, and his name is Landon. And he asked me if I would do an episode on witches. So
Nice.
it sounds like an easy topic, except there's such a variety of things and such a variety of definitions for the word witch. So I picked a couple different types of witches, and we're going to talk about them. That concept of witchcraft is really just about as old as any spiritual concept for mankind. We see the story of witches in the Bible. There is the story of the witch of Endor, who the King Saul went to because he was concerned that he was going to lose his throne, and he wanted to talk to the prophet Samuel, and he thought she could conjure Samuel up, and she did in the story. And then Samuel rebuked him. So that, that idea of there being somebody who can conjure or foresee or use different types of magic is as old as time, really. And that was the first witch that you will encounter in most cultures, although in pagan cultures you'll see variations in different forms of witchcraft throughout their histories as well. So one of the really interesting figures in European culture is the witch called Baba Yaga, and she's a folklore type witch, if you will.
Right.
She's described as having daggers for teeth and being hideously ugly. She lives in the forest in a little cabin and flies around on a broomstick, which seems to be probably the genesis for the idea of flying with broomsticks, or at least one of the genesis for that. And she says that she rides in a great mortar at times. So that means like a mortar and pestle, like a great big half circular thing, which kind of reminded me of the idea of a UFO, frankly. If you were an ancient people and you saw a half circle thing with a glass top and somebody in it, you could see that being mistaken. Yeah, it sort of was sort of surprising to see that in there. She supposedly was one of the female goddesses of the Russian culture at the time, and she was highly revered in her time period, but she's kind of gotten knocked down a peg or two now. So now she's a folklore creature who ate children and had bony legs, and she would cackle at her guests, "Fee, fee, I smell a Russian bone," and stuff like that. So she was possessed supposedly with powers that she could call in people. She, again, was very cannibalistic. Some depictions of her say she was an ogress who kidnapped children. In Slavic tradition, she's very malevolent, but she can also be a benefactress. So if you pleased her, she was gracious to you. If you did not please her, she could be very angry and antagonistic. In the Christian era, she kind of got downgraded to the word witch. It's from being, a goddess to a witch. She often is depicted as standing on hen's legs instead of having human legs. And there's a story that says that she was an evil stepmother who attempted to have her daughter eaten at one point in time. And the stories have kind of morphed out from there. So I just wanted to kind of point out that in ancient cultures, there's all these different goddesses that have become known as witches today because they've been degraded or demoted, if you will, as we've changed our culture. So that said, let's go to probably the most famous American witch, which would be the Bell Witch. So for those who are not aware, in Robertson County, Tennessee, in 1804, a couple by the name of John and Lucy Bell and their family bought a home. They'd moved from North Carolina, and they moved into middle Tennessee. They lived in this beautiful farm, this gorgeous house, and had a big, prosperous farm for about 10 years before things went sour for them. And what happened was about 1816, the Bells began to notice bizarre things happening in their house. They didn't say anything about it to anybody because it was shameful. They didn't want anyone to know. So they would hear footsteps, there would be objects moved, things thrown from nowhere. And in the field, they saw an animal with the body of a dog and a chicken's head that would lope through the fields, and they would watch it. And they were, there were others that said they saw what looked like a dog with a giant rabbit's head. And this creature they couldn't explain. This went on for quite a while. The kids were being disturbed. Their sleep was difficult. The normal stuff you would expect from a haunting, blankets being snatched off beds and stuff like that. But then it became almost, well, it did definitely become more poltergeist-like. So there were pillows twisted into the faces. There were objects dropped out of the sky, like potatoes falling out of the ceiling. Stones being pelted at the house, stuff like that. And of course, there's no explanation for that stuff when it happens. And the more it happened, these were a God-fearing family. The father eventually, he kept counseling everybody to keep the secret, keep the secret. And then eventually, it became much more physical. John began to feel physical pain. His one daughter came to being hit and punched. The little girl was a teenager named Betsy Bell. And it seemed like this entity took a particular disliking to Betsy. And he would slap, they would hear the somebody getting slapped, and Betsy would scream, and there would be a handprint on her face. But they were all in full view of Betsy at the time, and she didn't do it. Or she would start screaming that her back was burning, and there would be burns on her back under her clothing. And, so this was really, you can imagine only how bad it was. Other family members reported being pinched, slapped, their hair pulled. Like I said, they would wake up in the middle of the night with their blankets ripped off of them. And when this would happen, they would recite prayers. They would, try to invoke God or to endure this as best they could. And it was, very difficult. Finally, John he didn't know what to do. He was at his wit's end. So he decided to approach a neighbor who was a good friend. And he told his neighbor, and his neighbor was like, we have a prayer meeting every week. Let's talk to the gentleman at the prayer meeting and see if our church can lift you up and help you through this bad time. This sounds like an evil spirit. At one point, this entity begins to speak in the air, like literally voice coming out of the air in front of people. So when the church group came, it began to taunt them, literally taunt them. And it told them that her name was Kate Bat, that John had cheated her back in North Carolina, and she would have her revenge. And John denied all of this. He's like, I never heard of Kate Bat, and certainly never cheated a woman named Kate Bat. So, they just continue to endure it. Now they're becoming a 7 days wonder. The word had spread. People were coming to experience the witch, and it was, interesting for them. Ministers came to try to get rid of her, and it just continued on. Interestingly enough, General Jackson, Andrew Jackson, heard the story, and he actually showed up there. He was traveling through the area and heard the story, him and his group of people he was traveling with, and they ended up at the Bell Farm. And the story goes like this. As they were approaching up the road from the farm before they got there, all of a sudden the wagon that Jackson was riding in stopped, and the horse was straining to pull it but could not pull it. And this is before he ever got to the house. And the voice of this spirit called out, "So, General Jackson, you've come to see me, have you?" And he's like, "Where did that come from?" Everybody was startled because up until that point, it's an interesting story, but now you're experiencing it's different, and she said, you know, I'll not let that horse pull the wagon until I say so. And they got out and they tried to pull the horse forward, tugging at the reins and what have you, and nothing. The horse couldn't seem to move it. It was like it was filled with lead. It was so full and so hard to move. And as the men are tugging at this poor horse and trying to pull it, I'm sure the bit was biting in its mouth and what have you. She cackled and she said, "Oh, I suppose it's time for you to finish your trip." And she suddenly the horse, as though somebody had slapped it on the rump, shot forward, knocking people over. And they were able to continue on to the Bell farm. And of course, they heard all the stories when they got there. And they walked through the house. The spirit teased them, called them names, and some of the people in Jackson's party decided that they did not want to stay for the night, and so they slept outside. But Jackson himself was given a bed in the house, and a couple men slept on the floor in the room, figuring that they would take turns staying awake so somebody would be able to catch the person pretending to be the witch, And it didn't seem to work out that way. In the morning, Jackson got up and he announced very abruptly that he and his men were going to leave now. Not a word was said. And he got out and he just left as fast as he could go. He never said to anybody what occurred that night, but certainly something must have spooked them enough that they decided to leave. And the story is really sad because John Bell kept getting more and more ill. He ended up bedridden. And Kate Bat was harassing him, telling him she was going to kill him. And in the end, there was a doctor who was brought in, and he was giving John some medication to hopefully help him. And one morning, John's wife got up, she gave him the medication, and it was still in the bottle, locked in their bedroom with them, and he died seconds later. The doctor, of course, was called, and the story says that the doctor tested the medicine, which smelled suspiciously of almonds, on the family cat who died as well. And it turned out that the medicine had been laced with arsenic, which everybody in the family denied. And Kate yodeled gleefully, "I told you I would kill that old man. I told you I would." She would stay with the family for 4 years, harassing and just making life an absolute living hell. And at the end of the 4 years, she went away. But 7 years later, mysteriously, she came back. And she told them she had been abiding on the farm in a place called the Cave, which is now known as the Bell Witch Cave. And people can go there today. Some people have some very interesting stories. If the listeners want to go check them out a little bit, they're fascinating stories.
Next time I'm in that region, I'm going to look that one up.
Yeah, and like I said, it's an amazing story because it's got so many witnesses, eyewitnesses. I mean, you're getting all the way up to, General Jackson. And many of these people were independent parties, third parties that just came in, ministers and what have you, who all testified to what was going on this property.
Yeah. But everything you've told, it was basically people trying to experience it, but were there any mitigation efforts done?
There were. The church group would come in and try to pray, and she would read Bible verses back to them, the witch. Or she would pull a Bible out of somebody's hand and throw it across the room and stuff like that. Like, she was very contemptuous of religious objects. She seemed to want to let them know that these did not bother her at all. And she found it very puny, their efforts to try to make her go away. Yeah, she was a really frightening figure. And you'll see there's another one in West Virginia called The Wizard's Clip, which is a story about an invisible entity that literally would cut. You would hear what sounded like a pair of scissors, and then there would be cuts and multiple cuts in people's clothing and bedding, all kinds of stuff. And this went on for us a couple years, several years. And the family was Protestant when it all began. and they would ask their minister, and then they would ask other ministers to come and help them. And whatever this particular thing was, it sheared the cat's fur, it cut the dog's tail, it would snip the hair off the children's heads. It was just this invisible something, and you would never see anything. You would hear the slicing of scissors snapping, and then somebody would yell, or their clothes would have holes all through them, stuff like that. And this one has an interesting and completely different ending. So the family that this happened to, the father of the family, again, he had asked his own church, and eventually one of the pastors said to him, "I hear the Catholics can handle stuff like that. Maybe you should go find a Catholic priest." So he did. Actually, a priest came to him eventually, and the guy just come walking down the road one day, stopped at the house. They offered him hospitality, found out he was a priest, and he began experiencing what was going on, witnessing it. And through his mitigation efforts and his prayers, eventually was able to make this entity leave, and the family would convert to Catholicism in gratitude for being relieved of this thing that had been going on for years in their world.
Fascinating story.
Yeah, I mean, and it's, like I said, the one was contemptuous of it. The other one seemed to eventually flee from the religion. It didn't happen overnight. It took weeks and weeks. But as long as that priest was there, there was a measure of relief for the family. And so they begged him to continue to stay on. And he stayed on until he had managed to give them the protection against this thing, and it finally fled.
Yeah, my thoughts on that were, I mean, if something was, demonic,
Mm-hmm.
quote, anti-religion, then you would think some type of religious ceremony, rite, or something like that would be effective. But the Bell Witch, that was not effective, and out and out contempt for things of a religious nature, makes me think that was, I would call that much more human behavior rather than a demonic. Yeah. But it's odd that, wherever the witch actually was, to be able to either project herself or just, after death, to continue or to do things that would require a corporeal person to do.
Yeah, like I said, there was a lot of like poltergeist activity around this case. Now, I will tell you that there are demonic entities that are contemptuous of religious objects, for at least for a while, not always forever. But I have to tell you, I've encountered one particular case where the demonically possessed person, and she, to my way of thinking, was indeed possessed. I mean, she spoke in different languages. She could travel distances at speeds that weren't human. She attempted to murder her mother on multiple occasions. Her brother, who was a pastor, she had 3 brothers and 2 of them were pastors. And he came into the house one day and heard her talking in the bedroom and a male voice answering her. He assumed there was a man in the room with her, and he burst into the room, and she was alone, and both voices were coming from her throat. And she could sit in a church for a church service. I've seen her do it. I actually knew this woman.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't like, this one's not one from a book. And whenever she would be put into a psych facility, because, the next thing is, well, maybe she had a psychological problem, and she would be admitted, and she would be considered cured. Everything was great. Nothing happened. They would let her out 6 months to a year later, right back at it. It was like this one was strong enough that it could endure, if you will. So, and I don't know. But I will tell you, with the Bell Witch, there have been a lot of people who've researched John Bell's family when he lived in North Carolina to look for this woman who was slighted financially or in some way. And there's been some speculation about different people it could have been, but nobody really ever found a definitive answer.
Other than to make a good story. Yeah. A really good story.
Yeah, it does. But I've never found anything that was like, yeah, we can conclusively prove John Bell cheated this woman of her land or her cow or whatever, and her name was Kate Bat. So nobody's ever been able to locate a person by that name that had been a part of his life or in his world. So it's interesting for a lot of reasons. But witches come in lots of ways. We see them as these dancing figures from medieval history, in their black robes and what have you, dancing around a cauldron in crackling firelight. We see them in a lot of different ways. In the United States, those stories came over with the immigrants, and in Pennsylvania or any place where the Germanic people settled, you would come up with folk magic. Granny magic in the Appalachian Mountains is what they would call it. And it was a combination of primitive rituals, Bible quotes, and learning about the herbs and the uses of nature to help. Some of it was superstition, some of it definitely worked. So I talk about hexeria and brockery, which are two sides of the same coin, which is Pennsylvania German folk magic. Brockery is, easy way to explain is, brockery is using God to do healings and help, and hexeria is using evil, satanic, to help. At least that's how it's usually defined. So these would usually be mostly women, but not always. There were some very famous cases where they were men. And they would have a different ways. They would keep their own book of magic, and it would have their set spells and potions and ointments and things like that they would use. And some of it was like rubbing a potato on a wart and burying it at the full of the moon would make the wart disappear, or taking a string around a child 5 times or something like that, 6 times, whatever it was for that person, and then cutting the string in half, cut the pain. Taking an axe and plunging it into the floor in the doorway of a woman's room before she gave birth, as she's in labor, to cut the pain away. And some of it I can't explain. And I've had one encounter with it. I might have told the story before, but it's definitely apropos here. So I met a woman who was a Shaker faith, and I was working in a place where we had to handle hot glue and stuff like that, and I got burnt. I've told the story, I know, before, and I apologize, but I'm going to repeat it. And I got a string of glue on my finger that burned a long set of blisters right before lunch, and this older woman, she told me she could blow fire, which means blowing away the pain and the burn itself. To my absolute shock, I will tell you, I was a complete skeptic. I told her that I didn't believe that stuff. And she's like, what harm is there in trying? It's not going to hurt you any. And she took my finger and she would take her thumb very softly across it. She would blow on it, and then she would mutter something under her breath. And in a few minutes, the blisters went away. And these were raised blisters. And all that was left was a faint pink line. And she said to me, had I gotten it right away, I could have blown the line of pinkness away from you too. But it's as it had set in on your skin already and blistered. This is the best I can do. And I had a friend, a really good friend, who had an aunt who could blow blood. She could stop blood from flowing, and from a distance. So his story said he was a teenager working on the engine of his car, and something slipped, a screwdriver slipped and gashed his hand open. He went running in the house, and his mother wrapped it in a tea towel, and she's like, we got to call your aunt so and so, which would have been, I guess, his great aunt. And he's like, Mom, I got to get to the hospital. And it was really bleeding. He's like, it was sopping up the towel. And he's like, my mom was insistent. And he came from West Virginia. So they called the great aunt, and she began saying these prayers and doing whatever she was doing over the phone. And he's like, I looked down and I could see that the blood on she kept rewrapping it with new tea towels. And he said the new tea towel wasn't getting any blood on it, and it was a really deep gash. And at that moment on the phone, she said, I believe the bleeding stopped now, Scott. Go to the hospital and have them sew that thing up. And he said, I did. And they couldn't believe that he had gotten it to stop on his own, because it should have continued to bleed, a lot until they got there. But it stopped as this old lady was saying the prayers over it. So, others are things like, learning how to use herbs and weeds that we would consider weeds today in a medicinal way. So this was granny magic or folk magic, or hexeria. And there's a lot more to it than just that. There's a famous story of, several famous stories of down in the Lancaster and York area, but there's none more famous than the Blymeyer murder. So there were 3 men who were Pennsylvania German, one of whom was a Brocker himself, and they believed that this old man Blymeyer had put a curse on them, and they believed that the only way to get the curse off of them was to get his magic book and burn it. So they ended up breaking into the house. They knocked him over the head with a stick of wood. They knocked him unconscious. He wasn't dead. They didn't know that. They thought they killed him. They stole the 34 cents out of his pocket and set the house on fire. They killed him. The house still exists, by the way. The fire didn't burn that well. They didn't manage to burn the book, which was in a little root cellar under the house, and it became one of the most sensational murders in Pennsylvania history at the time, and this would have been in the 1930s. So that was, the depth of people believing it. It's fascinating. And those legends, that story I just told, actually comes from the mountains, from the mountain people, and probably the most famous of all the mountain witches of Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia area, which of course, West Virginia didn't exist in the 1700s, was a woman named Moll Derry. Now, Moll has a lot of folklore around her, but she was a real person. We know that her and her husband came as Hessian mercenaries to fight in the Revolutionary War for the British. And once they got here, they defected to the American side. Descriptions of her vary from she was so small she could sleep in a cradle to she was a giant of a woman. She was ugly, she was pretty, she was all that. So I can't tell you what she looked like. I imagine she was just a normal looking German lady, Her husband was renowned through the region for his ability to shoot and hunt. We know it was about 1760 when they got here to the United States. She and her husband joined David Morgan's famous sharpshooters, and there's stories about her husband's hunting prowess. And they said that he would rub something on his gun, some powder on the his gun, and then he would go out to hunt, and he would stalk within 20 to 30 yards of whatever he was hunting and then just stand stock still, and it was like the thing wouldn't see him. He would slowly raise the gun and just shoot it, and animals would just seem to keep on eating like they didn't know he was there. And there is speculation that perhaps she was already working her folk magic. There's some really interesting stories about her. She went to a woman, as an older lady, she went to this young woman who was just engaged to be married, and she told the young lady that she should not go walking with her boyfriend, especially not up near the falls, because he's got murder in his heart and he's going to kill you. You need to get away from that fella. And, the girl kind of poo-pooed the crazy old lady for telling this story. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened, and it became a very famous story out around Fayette County, Pennsylvania. And the story is that this young guy and his fiance went walking on a Sunday afternoon after church, and they got into a row, and he's tried to strangle her and knocked her into the falls, and she died. About a week after she was warned by Moll Derry not to do it. There's another story, that there was these 3 men in town who came into the area, and they would laugh at her. She was pretty old by then. It was about the 1790s. And these rough men came to the town of Derry where she lived, and they would poke fun at the old witch woman, and laugh at her. Oh, she can't do you no harm. She's just a crazy old lady and stuff like this. And they kind of roughed her up a couple times. shoving her down the street and stuff like that. She was angry and she couldn't protect herself. And she turned to one of them and she said, "You'll see, all three of you are going to die by hanging." And they laughed at her, and she went scurrying off. Well, the first man, his name was John McFall. He killed a tavern keeper in a drunken rage one night and was hanged in Fayette County. The other two men skedaddled out of the area after that happened because they were going to try to avoid the curse. Well, the second one, Ned Cassidy, he murdered a fella in a fight in Ohio, and he got hung out there. And the third man, whose name unfortunately is not preserved, when he heard what happened to Cassidy, he hung himself in Greene County, Pennsylvania. Why he chose that route, I don't know. But there were so many stories about this woman. She could find objects that were lost. She made a living at it. They said that she loved her coffee. That was one of her favorite things. And she said she liked her coffee and a little bit of money. So she would entertain people, telling them stories. She'd help find treasures. She if you had lost something or you thought somebody had put a curse on you or you were sick all the time, you'd go to Mulderry and you would, and she'd help you out. And she seemed to make a living doing it. And there were whispers that she had, as they put it, intimate dealings with the devil. But other people said she was a kind woman and always, tried to do nice things, with the exception of that one event. That's the only story that talks of her being mean or evil in any way. Other than that, most people described her as kindly and helpful, and she would often do things for people without them being able to pay her back right away. Or if somebody was sick or doing poorly, she'd go and nurse them. So she's an interesting character. And as you get into the origins of folk magic in the Appalachian Mountains and Pennsylvania German territory, you're going to come across a lot of those stories. And there are witch stories from all over. Years before the Salem witch trials in Pennsylvania, we had witch trials, but they didn't turn out the way the ones in Salem did. There, people were tried, and I believe the one lady was found to be guilty of being defamed for being a witch. So basically, she had the reputation for being a witch, and that's all that happened. Is her husband had to pay some money to the court and promise to keep her from practicing witchcraft for the next 6 months. And it was kind of a more happy, judicious kind of way of dealing with it. Nobody was killed or anything. But the court had to deal with two things. They had to satisfy the people who were outraged at this woman, saying she stole the milk from their cows by milking a tea towel in her kitchen, and she put a hex on their horse and their horse got sick. And so they were angry with her because these were the things that they used for their livelihood. And so the court couldn't totally dismiss them and say you're an idiot. So the court came up with this kind of middle of the road approach. Okay, she's got the reputation for being a witch, but we can't say she ever did anything wrong. Yeah, I mean, I feel bad for her. I mean, like, there's another case in Allegheny County in 1802 where this mob grabbed this woman and screamed she was a witch and told all these stories. Well, the constable took the woman and they ended up trying her, and the judge, he was really stuck. He didn't know what to do. He had this mob that was ready to burn the courthouse down outside, and he had a woman that, he didn't believe in witches. So what was he supposed to do? So what he ended up doing was telling the people in the mob, y'all need to calm down. I need to go look in my legal books and see if there's any laws on this. And what he was doing was buying time, and he paid somebody to sneak her out of the courthouse and get her out of the area. And then he came back and he said, she's escaped. And they're like, what do you mean she's escaped? And he's like, I don't know. She's escaped, and if she's not here, I can't make any pronouncements on her, and I can't pass sentence. So we're just going to have to wait till she turns up again. Of course, she never did.
That's humorous.
Yeah, I mean, what was he going to do?
Mm-hmm.
So he figured out the best way, he could to save her from being killed by the mob, or having to rule that she was or wasn't a witch by his little bit of trickery. But there were many people who were accused of witchcraft in all around the country, frankly, and some of them went poorly, the worst, of course, being the ones in Salem. Some went well when the people were clever or judicious. The one that was defamed as being a witch, it said that it was William Penn himself who came up with that. I'll grant you that she's got a reputation for being a witch, but she's never shown by any means that she's actually performed witchcraft. So we'll find her guilty of the reputation of being a witch, but we won't find her guilty of witchcraft. Think about it. You have a mob of really crazy, whacked out people that are willing to burn your buildings down and kill people. You've got to do something to appease them, but at the same time, if you really believe in justice, you can't let something bad happen to an innocent person. So they had to come up with whatever they could think of at the moment.
That's pretty ingenious, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I love the one about the guy in Allegheny County. I think that's great because they were kind of bowing to the law. So he's like, well, let me see what my legal books say. Give me a while. Meanwhile, he's making arrangements to sneak her out of the court and get her away from any from the harm's way. And it's a great story for that reason.
Well, if you think about it, people have, probably since the beginning of time, they don't understand something. Of course, there has to be, then you're a witch, or, you're possessed or something like that, simply because it's not understood.
And they didn't have explanations for why their horse suddenly came up lame, or what have you. But then there are some odd stories. There's a story from Fulton County, Pennsylvania, that I've written about before. And it was about this old woman who was considered a witch, and she could stop horses in fields. And there was apparently her neighbor would like infringe upon her side of this great big set of fields, and half of the field was hers and half of the field was his, where the property line ran through. And he would infringe on her side and cut some of her hay, and that made her do with less. And of course, she had to feed her livestock for the winter as well. So she went out one day and she was really angry, and she cussed him out one side and down the other, and she said, you won't be able to move them horses today. I won't see to it. I'll see to it. And the story is that for the entire day, the horses stood stock still. They would not move, like their muscles were frozen. And at the end of the day, when her hay was all cut and brought in, then she said whatever words she said, and the horses took off and they got them to the barn. Now, I can't explain why that would work or whatever, but I will tell you, I think there are things that we don't understand. I believe in mind over matter in a lot of instances. I've seen it where it's happened. I've experienced it. And I can't tell you, like the blisters, that was a biological thing. I can't tell you how they went away, but they did. And I know they didn't go away because I wanted them to go away, because I didn't believe her. So if they went away because the prayers she was muttering worked, or her faith was so strong that it literally impacted my hand. I don't know the answer. And some of it, I know it sounds hokey, but if it works, it works. And I would imagine many a physician has pulled the same thing. It's kind of like the placebo effect. It worked, so doctors did it. If they give you a sugar pill and you start to feel better, they've cured you. Well, it's kind of the spiritual equivalent to that in some respects. And some of it, I don't know why it works, but I will tell you, my grandmother-in-law, she would go by the old ways, the almanacs, the farmer's almanac. It'll tell you things like plant potatoes at a certain time when the moon's at a certain phase, and they'll grow well for you. If you plant them at the wrong phase, they'll be scraggly and there won't be many potatoes this year. Or chop a cherry tree on the new moon, and the sprouts won't come up and you won't have to deal with it again. Things like that. And she lived by that stuff. And I lived over there with her for years, and I would be surprised sometimes at some of the stuff that she would say, and it would seem to work. Like she would tell me, oh, I know my son wants me to plant potatoes this weekend, and I'm not doing it. Nope, not till the full of the moon. And he'd plant potatoes that weekend. And now this is on the same property, a couple 100 yards apart. They had 2 big gardens. And she'd wait till the full moon and go out there and hoe in her potatoes. And her potatoes would just come out baskets full, and his would be all scabby and just a few potatoes that year. And she'd say, I told you, son, you're supposed to plant at the full of the moon. And I don't know what else you could have explained. It was the same ground in the same area. He fertilized them both the same, tilled them the same. The only thing that was different is she refused to plant her potatoes until she felt the moon was in the right phase. Just like they've done experiments where they've took a series of plants. They all came from the same parent plant, all in the same or type of earth, all of that. Put them all in a window, and 5 of them they talk to, 2 of them they pray to, pray for, pray over, and a couple of them they yell at. And the ones you talk to are nice. The ones you prayed over end up blooming crazy. And the ones you yelled at are spindly. They don't know exactly why that happens, but they know it happens. Same with music. Cows, farmers play certain types of music in their barns, and they've actually done studies and proven that classical music and country music will cause a cow to produce more milk than hard rock.
I still like rock.
Well, and I'm not picking on rock, but I'm just saying it's something about it that, it makes the cows produce less milk. I don't know why it would do that, but it seems to. So there's a lot of stuff like that. But to get back to our witches, if there are witches, there's got to be witch killers or witch hunters. So, there's always got to be another side to that,
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So if there's people making their living as witches or helping, folks as witches, there's bound to be folks that are going to expose them. And in Warren County, Pennsylvania, there was one. His name was John Myers, and he lived in the 1800s. And there was a historian by the name of George Sweetnam. I've enjoyed his books for many years, who tells the story of John Myers, the witch hunter. He would seek out people who were hexed. He would take a piece of paper and put a candle on it, and it would cast a shadow, and he would draw the shadow of the outline of a person that he said he saw cast by the candle behind the piece of paper. And then he would take that, he'd cut it out, he'd pin it to a board, and then he would shoot this piece of paper with a bullet with a little bit of silver in it. And the witch would die and the hex would be lifted, is what he would tell people. Don't worry, the witch is dead now, and the hex is lifted, and you're able to, to do things. I read across a story here a couple weeks back of an old fella who lived down in West Virginia, and he was a witch hunter in his own right. But he was a little more judicious. He didn't try to shoot all the witches dead. He would, there was this lady that claimed that her cow stopped milking, and there's a tradition in some of the Pennsylvania German folk magic that if you hex a cow, you can sit in your own kitchen. So I hexed your cow, and I come back to my house and I take my tea towel and I put a bucket underneath it, and I wring my tea towel out every morning and every night whenever you'd be milking your cow. I would end up with your milk in my bucket, and you would end up with almost nothing in your bucket. And you would know that somebody bewitched you and stole your milk. So according to the story, he had a lady that come to him telling him that. And through a series of events, he did a little bit of his hocus pocus and magic stuff. And the lady that he supposedly was putting the hex on, she broke her hand. He took a piece of wood and he cracked it across the rump of the cow, and he said, that'll take care of it. Come morning, you look for who in the town suddenly got a broken hand, and you'll know who your witch was. And the next morning, a lady down the way said she couldn't give an explanation for it. She just woke up and her hand was broken. And he said, that's the woman who was stealing the milk. She won't be stealing no more milk now.
Why does that sound like you're using witchcraft against witchcraft?
It very well could be. Some of the other things that particularly in Brockery, Pennsylvania German magic, they would put these little spells or well wishes and stuff in little glass bottles, and they would tuck them in their barns or their basements or in the eaves of their house, and it would bring good luck or protect their home. They do something called Himmelbriefs. It's a set of scriptures or writings that are beautifully penned, and you juxtaposition them across the room from a picture of Christ, and it's to bring peace and keep your house from being cursed, or people in your home from being cursed. There's all kinds of interesting little tidbits and what have you. And it's a very complicated subject, but I think we've at least kind of touched on a lot of different types of witches tonight. So I believe this is going to go out hopefully around Halloween. So I just want to take the moment before we end and say to everybody, I wish you a happy and safe Halloween.
Happy All Hallows Eve. Yes. So if you've enjoyed this program, this presentation from Patty, please consider clicking the subscribe button down below or the like button. If you're listening to a podcast platform, rate us with a commensurate number of stars if you like this. And we have a Facebook page, and we would be very happy if you were to join our Facebook group. I think the last time I looked, we had 537.
Wow.
Which is, considering a year ago that we had 0, it's doing quite well. So the Facebook group is out there, the Paranormalist Podcast. We have email address paranormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com. And you could be like one of the, like I believe you said, Landon,
Yeah.
who suggested this episode, and send us your ideas, your thoughts. You can always comment on the YouTube videos as well. And with that, I believe I've said my piece.
So I wish you good night now too, Stu. Have a good evening.
All right, thanks. You too, Patty.